Good morning, good evening, or good afternoon, wherever and whenever you are listening or watching today's podcast. I am Adam Parry, editor at Event Industry News. And today I have a very special guest and a long time event industry friend, Allan Scott, here with me today to talk about the power of podcasting in a pandemic. I don't know if I've just coined that phrase, maybe, I don't know. But Jason is a podcast host, tutor, teacher, speaker. What doesn't he do? But Jason, explain to people listening better than I can what you do for our sector in the industry.
Thank you very much. Well, I was an industry person like yourself. I organized events. I did events nonstop for over a decade. I unfortunately found out that after going blind for 4 days that I had a autoimmune disease, multiple sclerosis. I decided to go into the event tech world, like completely in your space. I tried to start the LinkedIn for venues for events called Venue Me. And I launched a podcast to tell the tale of swapping roles in the hope that it would inspire, it would be a great story. I could, play it for my kids. It would be easier than trying to film everything sort of Casey Neistat vlog style. And then the podcast took off. It did incredibly well. Sadly, spoiler alert, my tech business collapsed, but my podcast did really well. And so well, in fact, that I was invited to number 10 Downing Street to talk about the power of podcasting storytelling. I won top 100 small businesses at the time. I found multiple ways to monetize. And then I created a formula. And anyone who's in science knows a formula only works if it's repeatable, no matter who is doing the experiment. So I started a second show, which was called Not Another Crypto. That did very well within the crypto and blockchain space. I sold it to be a co-owner of a tech business. I started another one, this time in the event space, completely with nothing else. It was called Smarter Event Planning. It says it's got 127,000 listeners, 21,000 on our newsletter subscriber base. And same thing, just followed a formula and then realized I could teach this to other people so that they could use the power of podcasting to link to their audience, to create great content, perennial content, but they could spread the message of what they were doing. They could promote their shows. And that's what I've been doing. I've been running a course and a masterclass where we kind of have real accountability and take them from zero to online podcasting hero.
Okay, so let's rewind because there's a lot there and I'd love to dissect this up. There's some amazing tidbits in there already, but let's go back to you launching your tech business, right? You're a speaker, you're a paid speaker, people pay you good money to engage their audience. Was that the reason you launched a podcast? Was that a fair transition in leveraging podcasting and that kind of content opportunity as a speaker? Did you see that move quite easily?
Absolutely. I knew it would be my first monetization strategy, is that they would immediately hear me speak. They'd notice I don't do any ands, buts, likes, ums, ahs. And they'd go, oh, he's a good speaker. They knew that I could propose concepts and I could translate various tech talks, et cetera, et cetera. All these things were just giving me a great show reel for my speaking opportunities. And if someone said to me, oh, Jason, I'm thinking about hiring you for a talk on health and well-being, I could say, great, actually, I did an episode of that, season 2, episode 5. You can hear me give a speech about that. And there it was. There was no need. They didn't have to go look for it. I didn't have to go back to the office. I didn't have to call my VA and say, send a link. I could just pick up your phone, go to iTunes, go to Spotify, and there I am. And there's the talk. And it's canned, it's done. Granted, I try and do a talk different every single time I do it, but they could hear the entire speech and idea. So it became the very first way I monetized the podcast was by selling talks, which I still do to this day. I now do audiobooks all the time. I do an audiobook every 3 months, and it's the exact podcasts, cutting them up and make them into books. Number 2 of the monetization strategies of a podcast.
Okay, so does 3 bring us on to how you got involved with the Not Another Crypto podcast then? Was that somebody else seeing you as a podcast host, as a speaker, and going, this guy can help me with my podcast and leverage my audience and engage my audience? Is that how that kind of worked out?
100%. That's exactly how it worked. They heard me on another show. They were looking at how did they connect product to an engaged audience. The beauty of podcasting, and this is something which is very different to a virtual event, is that you are creating a fan base that keeps coming back. It's a subscriber. I don't miss an episode of Joe Exotic on Tiger King because I subscribe to that show. Immediately, I am now in, right? I'm in the mix. I'm a fan. I do something active versus passive. Unlike virtual events where it's kind of the old school of television where I have to be at a place at a certain time to be a part of something. It's not. I get to it when I get to it. And he really understood that. And he had this tech platform and he thought, what a great way. One, for me to get my word out there. Two, to create an engaged audience of people that subscribe, that get information every single day. Three, unlike any other medium, I don't have to go hashtag sponsored content. I don't have to say paid commercial. I can just say this is the greatest tech product in crypto in the world and not worry about litigation. Then I can leverage expertise by getting other experts on the show. It suddenly is cool by association. Well, they use the platform Pink. They like the investment tech then provided. So that becomes cool. Also client acquisition, which is another one, right? You can't get someone on a phone. You can't get through the gatekeeper. Well, get them on your podcast to talk narcissistically about their own product. And suddenly you've got an opportunity to sell them yours.
Yeah. And I think what we found from our podcast as well is, let's take the Pink podcast. Maybe they want to get in front of somebody. They want that one-on-one time. They might not be able to get a meeting with them, but, you know, hang a carrot out to their own self-importance, maybe. If that's probably a negative way of putting it, but you know, if you look to them and say, listen, we would love for you to speak about what you do and how you do it to our audience, then by proxy that gets you that one-on-one, very personal and very in-depth meeting as well, because you get as the host, you get all the opportunity to ask as many questions and whatever questions and as deep questions as you want. So you can actually steer it how you want as well. So I think that's a really interesting strategy as somebody who might be looking to launch a podcast for their business, for their supplier, as an organizer, that gives them the free will to, and the right to invite those people in that might be able to get meetings with, and actually quiz them however they want. It's a really interesting dynamic.
And it's both sided. And I think that's something else people forget. Not only can you get your heroes on your show and and your potential clients, but you can get your competitors on your show, and you can take apart what's wrong with their products while highlighting what's right with yours. So for sponsors of podcasts, and this is famous, Procter & Gamble during the Great Depression of 1923, they put all their money into this thing called radio broadcasting, because it was an opportunity to push their products through what they then called soap operas, hence Procter & Gamble, soap operas, these stories where they constantly mentioned their products and spoke badly about their competition. And you can do this in a podcast, and it still works. It's absolutely brilliant.
So that's where Joey Exotic went wrong. He should have had a podcast, right?
He should have had a podcast. Because I'll tell you another thing, right? If anyone who is a total fan, as I am, of this whole concept of Joe Exotic goes and watches these episodes, it's the same problem you have with a virtual event. It's one person looking directly into a steady cam, just filming. That's very difficult to be exciting, no matter how great the host is, how much flagellation of hand movement goes on. There's a whole bunch of things that need to work. With a podcast, it doesn't. I can sound as good as Joe Rogan, who spends $50,000 a season on his podcast, and I spend less than $500, because all I need is a good producer to equalize my sound and a good pop filter and a headphone and a microphone, and I'm good to go with a Skype connection or a Zoom. Whereas you need proper studio quality to make a great virtual event or webinar or video, as you know, as Casey Neistat has proved, and now everyone's trying to be Casey versus this sort of shot.
And I think let's dig into some of those comparisons, because that's one of the reasons I wanted to get you onto this podcast today. We clearly can see we publish a lot of this news and a lot of information about suppliers who can help leverage virtual event technologies, live streaming, etc., for those event organizers to reach an audience, which is great, and it's working, and those event organizers are already making money out of it. I'm connected with a number that are. That's great to see. However, not all of the industry has the budget that event organizer has. Not all of the events industry has the relationships with the sponsors to make that dynamic work, and not all have an audience that is willing to pony up 250, 300 quid to sit through an event. You know, there's a whole supply chain that's there that doesn't have that ability necessarily. But they are connected to great people, great minds, great prospects, etc. They have those relationships. They just don't necessarily have some of the other building blocks to create what I would call an engaging event, anybody can run a webinar, right? Let's be honest about it. I can set a webinar up tomorrow, bring you on, call it a virtual event, and it's just, yeah, it's probably just more of a podcast than anybody really doing anything
Absolutely.
else. Or it's one of those really bland presentations, which is actually a demo disguised as a virtual event of my services kind of thing.
Yeah.
But virtual events, for me, actually podcasts can come out of them. I've started to see podcasts happening at live events as part of the content strategy. And I think for me, I don't know whether you agree with this, Jason, podcasts actually offer much more potential scope for audience engagement than a virtual event does, in the sense that the discoverability of podcasts is higher. The networks in which those podcasts are distributed on and sit on have been built. They've been built on for years. People are used to using them as well. The access to get that into the attendee or your listener's phone device is much easier. And I would argue that the attention span of a podcast is a lot higher or a lot longer than a potential virtual event. And I'm just talking about my own experience here. You mentioned Joe Rogan a little bit earlier on. I will listen to a 3-hour podcast with Joe Rogan on the right subject on a commute somewhere to a meeting or in the gym, or break it up and stuff like that. I don't think I've ever sat through a 3-hour presentation for anything ever in my life. So that for me kind of suggests that podcasts are this untapped potential of ways of communicating and engaging your audience on a particular subject, your particular niche, like the crypto one that you guys did. How do you see it? Do you agree? Do you see it slightly differently?
100%. No, again, statistically, if you have a video, and you know this, you're on YouTube, if you have a video that is longer than 5 minutes and someone watches for more than 5 minutes, you're on the top 80% percentile of engagement. More than 5 minutes, that's top 80. So that means what? That means that 80% of people have stopped watching after 5 minutes. The average podcast is 28 minutes long and has a 90% completion rate. Well, I don't know about you, but I know that every product, service I've ever sold, every business I've ever consulted for, and every book I've ever read about great business says the only way that people buy from you is because they like, know, and trust you. Well, I've got a much better chance of knowing you, liking, and trusting you if I've spent over 20 minutes with you versus less than 5 minutes with you. So yes, 100%. There is something about long form content when it comes to podcasting. I write huge articles, right? For LinkedIn, for Medium, for all the people. I write books. I don't get the engagement I get with a 15-minute podcast on, which is free, which anyone can get at any time. And there's something about, and then people binge listen. They like one and suddenly they subscribe. They listen to a second, a third. They go to your back catalog, much like they do with records and albums. And that is something else which is incredibly special about this, because it is the most native of mediums. It's storytelling. It's one person speaking to another, whether like we are now in a sort of typical format of Q&A, or whether I'm talking directly to my listener. That is something you almost, again, don't get from a webinar. And a lot of webinars and virtual events, they need multiple staff members, as you know, meeting rooms that need to be set up on the side, MCs hosting this big contingent for it to be done properly. With a podcast, you don't.
Yeah. And I think there's an argument there for overall using a podcast for revenue generation, and I'm segueing into your 22 ways to make a podcast pay, is that, when you take all that work that goes into delivering a virtual event, you take platform costs, you take distribution costs, staffing costs, marketing, promotion costs, etc. If you're lucky enough, you have amazing content where you can charge tickets, and that's a fair excuse to do a virtual event with as a revenue stream. But then you also got to sponsor it and all this kind of stuff. It's a big play, right? It's not a super easy play into, we're just going to launch a virtual event. But actually, for probably sub £1,000, you can have a great mic, great camera, a subscription to Zoom like we're on now. And you can still engage your speakers with a great host like yourself. Maybe that's one of the biggest costs. And go, right, Jason, I want you to interview on this particular theme of event or topic, these 15 speakers, as you would like keynote style Q&A on stage, that kind of stuff. Give them their own part in that. And then sell that to a sponsor. So for $1,000 or a couple of grand and a speaker, a host fee like yourself, you might be able to still push out what essentially is a virtual content stream, a stage, and make just as much money, except with probably 10% of the work.
100%.
So that's just my own opinion.
It's true. It's factual. It's proven again and again. We did it. Season 2 of the Guestless podcast. Season 2 of Smarter Event Planning podcast is all about Berlin. And surprisingly, every single venue is in Berlin. Every association we spoke to is in Berlin. Well, that's not an accident. That is an event we put out as a podcast, which is Berlin specific.
Yep, absolutely. And in the interest of transparency, event industry news, our podcast is a revenue stream. People put their brand against it to reach people that are listening to us, that are our readership. And that works great for them in terms of scope, of coverage, of impressions, and that kind of stuff.
So let's use. I mean, that's another benefit. Like, I've used a show that I know of yours before, again and again and again. Someone said, "Oh, Jason, have you ever written a book or something?" I said, "Oh, not only have I written one, but I did a great interview with Event Industry News. Let me send you the link."
Mm-hmm.
So this, it's perennial, and I can use it again and again. And I could take that RSS feed, because it's just a feed, it's just a link back, and stick it on my website. I can embed it into my LinkedIn posts. I can add to my, and you've done all the work. But I get to reuse it again and again and again as a guest, as someone that's been on the show.
Absolutely. So for anybody listening to this podcast now who's probably at that point where they're like, I've got some interesting people that I could speak to. I'm confident enough to be able to set up a Zoom meeting and speak into a microphone. But they're contemplating, like, can I make this pay? Can I make money? Can I make revenue from me spending this time speaking to these interesting people? You mentioned and promote the fact that you have found 22 ways to make money from a podcast. Can you divulge some of those and maybe tell us a little bit more about where people can find the full list of 22? Because I think 22 might take us probably a couple of hours to go through. But what's the top ones, and where can people find the other stuff?
Of course. So www.apodcastmasterclass.com is where we teach it, the business of podcasting. And we also have a hand-holding experience. You come on twice a week, Wednesday and Friday, 12 to 1, and we'll deal with you personally. We take small classes, only 12 people, and we pair them up. So they're always accountable to one other person plus me and my team.
Mm-hmm.
We also produce your first 3 shows, so we know that those first 3 are good. Now, that's one of the tricks. Networks only listen to your first episode. So when you send your podcast into iTunes, Spotify, etc., Spotify now being the biggest in the world, they only listen to episode 000, which is Tech Talk. It's really episode 1, but it's a 3 to 5 episode, which explains what's coming up in a show, who's coming up, what's going to be about. And the platform listens to it because they want to see if it will bring an audience to their platform, which is all they care about, right? So we teach that. And if you've got that, you've got your first monetization stream, because you can take that episode to an assembler and say, hey, this is the show. It's going to be called Smarter Event Planning. My avatar, my perfect listener, is a secretary or a personal assistant or an event who organizes events. And she's looking for tips, tools, tricks, technologies that can make her life easier, working smarter, not harder. That's the whole concept. That's my episode 1. Assembler says, oh, actually, that's the market for us. Yes. Then I said, great. Who would you like to get in front of? Who can't you get into a meeting? And they said, oh, that's interesting. How does that work? And I said, well, you will get on the show. And then it's very easy for me to say, oh, and our co-host is David from Assembler. Boom. Now I've got a second revenue stream. Not only is he my sponsor, but he's my show. Then I might say to him, David, I'm also going to have 10 quick fire questions. And what I'd like is for you to sponsor one of those questions. So I use the Assembler form to organize all my events. Well, that's a sponsored question. I happen to use Canvas Planner when I'm organizing all my collaborative tools. That's a sponsor. I don't have to say that, which again is a benefit. I have to go, the following question is sponsored by Canvas Planner. No, so I've now got 3 ways to profit from my podcast. And I haven't even talked advertising yet or listenership. I've had a video go viral on YouTube, hit 1 million. I thought, this is it, big money coming in. My check was £1,088. And that's because it was predominantly America-based, which is where all the money in YouTube comes from. I've had 1,000 listeners from a podcast and made £38,000 because all I did is I took 1,000 people and I sold them my book, which was £12. And they all went out and bought the book. So that's my next revenue, is have a product. It doesn't have to be a physical product. My first book was an ebook. Just they paid $9.99. It was sent across to them, and there it was. And I could have done that on Scriber for free.
And just on that point, if you are if you're a company listening to this and you're thinking, well, actually my intention is to do more lead generation, then that point still stands, right? Because you could create content, downloadable content, gated content, which is connected to the topic and subject matter and helpful to that audience member, and say, listen, we've got this free guide, this free book here. Give us your name and email address and a few details. That is another way to monetize your revenue stream, because then you can nurture in your marketing funnel that contact and hopefully make them into a paying customer later down the line, which may have you might be a tech company with $100,000 license fee out or something. So that one person is worth $100,000 to you, kind of thing. So that, yeah,
the cost of client acquisition is super high.
Yeah, even if it's free, you can still make that pay, right?
And that's another thing. Like we don't give away 22 ways. That's the secret sauce, right? That's our 11 herbs and spices. But often I'll talk to people. I'll say the 3 types of traffic: the traffic that you own, the traffic that you get, and the traffic that you pay for. Now, the traffic you paid for is advertising. We pay for an ad to be on Facebook or LinkedIn or Instagram or whatever it is. Well, that's great. But as long as those platforms exist, we're okay. But they disappear, I've lost that traffic. It's gone forever. Then there's the second one, which is, when people speak about it. So I'll finish this and I'll tell everyone about it. It's great, but you can't count on it. You can't count that I'm going to run out every single day to talk about you. And then there's the traffic you own, which is a subscriber. Whether that subscriber on your podcast is great, but a subscriber who gives you their email, like you said, that's when you've got them in your funnel. And for me, that whole business, my business is find a traffic source that you can drive it to something where you can get their information, that you can start that nurture campaign, that you can get them to know, like, and trust you. Because then whether I sell them a book, I've sold underwear, I sold men's Spanx called Spunks, just to test it, to see if my audience would buy. They've bought. I've sold events. I'll be at the following event. If you'd like to come see me, buy a ticket. We've sold that. So that's another monetary stream, right? You can drive a fan base, and you only need 1,000 true fans. Obviously, a Greg Kelly famous blog post went viral, mentioned by Tim Ferriss, Russell Brand, et cetera, et cetera. But just do the maths. 1,000 people spending £1,000 over the space of a year on your event is £1 million in revenue. What other platform allows that?
Yeah, absolutely. And I suppose that brings me on to individuals like yourself right now who are possibly looking at ways they can have an income stream, because the face-to-face events, I was speaking to a gentleman the other day, Brian Fanzo, Social Fans, and I think within the space of 24 hours, he had 6 months worth of work postpone and disappear. That's a huge loss to a professional speaker's income for that year. He's been very forward thinking. He's taken himself out there. He had, I think the other week, 17 inquiries in his inbox for virtual event hosting. But some people don't necessarily want to give their sessions away online, right? They prefer to have them there and then in the moment, and you can only hear that story and that session by physically being there in that presentation. They don't want their presentation to be online and people can just go to YouTube and see it, right? That's their secret sauce. But podcasts for professional speakers like yourself, actually in a time now, present a huge amount of opportunity to create revenue stream, right? There's probably a lot of companies out there that don't have the time, don't have the people, don't have the want or the need to deliver their own podcast. They don't want to host it themselves. But actually, as a marketing spend, would be quite happily to bring somebody like yourself in, set the content, have somebody else deliver it as a freelancer. And what would you say that would be worth as an income stream to a professional speaker on a retainer for, let's say, a podcast a month or something like that, Jason?
You can make anything from 550 up to £25,000 in a month.
Yeah.
Through it. I mean, I just had a brand new podcaster. She's never done anything. She did our course. English is her second language. She did her episode 1. We told her to send it out, that plus a media kit. We should teach her to put a media kit together. And she got a job at £550 doing 4 hours worth of work a month. And now she's running around trying to get more of those. Because here's the other thing, right, which we don't talk about, which is great for professional speakers. If I'm doing an event and I need to get someone to speak about event industry news or event tech, I'm going to ask you to be there.
Sure.
Now you've got to check your schedule, and your schedule's not available. Well, that's it. I can't do it. I would use the B word, bug it. But here's the thing about a podcast. I could just hire another host. You could send your information across. and they could still convey in a very great way of, great communicative way, everything you need to say and still sell you while you not being in the room. And no one cares. No one's going, that's not Adam. He's just talking about Adam. He's just mentioning Adam's articles or Adam's stuff. No one cares. They just want two things: information and entertainment. That's the pillars of podcasting. I was recently double-page spread in the voiceover magazine, which is called The Buzz. And I was shocked how many voiceover artists had never thought of getting into podcasting.
Really?
Like, it's such an obvious thing. So yes, that was a big, we got one of them, a wonderful Rachel, who's doing incredibly well with virtual events, her podcast, because she's constantly sharing. But she will share a snippet, say, if you want more of this, reach out to me, which is another obvious way to get paid through podcasting, is this kind of freemium to premium model.
And just on that, one of the things that I've seen from another podcast, which is a great model, is the owner of that podcast. The sponsorship is for him and his company in this instance, but this could work if you had sold this concept to another company. What he actually does is he has a regular rotation of podcast hosts, which come in together on certain podcasts to make up a larger, mind share. Definitely take his place when he can't physically be there himself. So when he's on the road, traveling, doing events, etc., he has other individuals jump in. And he takes a lion's share of that revenue against that podcast, but then pays those other podcast hosts to participate as freelancers. So he gets variety, coverage, cover for when he's too busy, that kind of stuff. And I can see actually, maybe this is an idea for you if you've not already done it, mate, the podcast speaker agency, right? It's the Jimmy Fallon. Here's Jimmy Fallon. He's $5,000 an episode. We'll manage him for you. We'll work with you as the professional thing. And then you also sell Jimmy to 3 other companies and take a commission off of Jimmy. You maybe have a collaboration of people that you're selling as a, that Sports Center Live kind of setup. It's the same 3 faces you see every morning, and that's the product. But as those individuals may be committed to other things, you still have that continuity of podcast. You still have that continuity of delivery of content, and you have variety, which is one of the other things I think is really important, is different people engaging with your potential speakers and stuff like that. So anybody listening to this, if you are thinking, we don't want to host a podcast, we don't want to necessarily do it ourselves, I think there's lots of opportunities to launch a podcast aligned with your brand and aligned with your audience, but just get those professionals in to help deliver that content for you and actually be the ones that do the hosting, do the management of it, set the speakers up, all that kind of stuff. I think there's still huge value in there. And £550 a month for sponsorship to reach there's no limit to the audience that you could tap into through a podcast, right? So the sky's the limit, really. It's peanuts when you think about it.
We've actually done that. Interestingly enough, we have a membership company who has a show, and they have different hosts do the show, but they're the intro voice and the outro voice, right? So that you immediately know who you're listening to. There's the voice, and then comes in this guest host, and what he's done very cleverly, and I won't give him a shameless plug, but each host that he brings in is an expert in the field of which they're doing the Q&A, which is great. So you've got this, Olympic storyteller having an interview with someone who does storytelling conventions, and they're having this great interview, which in fairness to him, he could never have done as well because he hasn't got that intrinsic knowledge. He's not an expert in that field. And it's exciting. He's got a great show, and it's really exciting because every week it's something different. But he starts it. It's his voice of God that comes on and goes, welcome to the da-da-da show where we bring you, and it's great. And that brings us to another monetary scheme. You can franchise. I have franchised one of my shows because you've really got a built-in audience base. So you don't have to host it anymore. No one cares if I'm the host of that particular show. What they care about is the message that's going out. So you can rent out your hosting, you can rent out your guesting, you can rent out the all sort of intrinsics. Much like if IBM suddenly said, hey, do you want to take over the magazine for IBTM? As long as we get that magazine as we enter the building, we don't really care what's on the front of it. And maybe that gives us an opportunity. Well, few people are franchising their podcast, which is ridiculous because they've got this audience base that honestly just wants the same thing they've always been given: format, function, and message.
And I think that brings on to another example of where I think you could really add huge amounts of value and diversify in your monetization strategy, even with your current audience, which is to do similar to what Event Industry News really does, which is we cover the whole market. So we cover festivals, concerts, tours, exhibitions, brand events, experiences, etc. We at the moment have just one podcast, Event Industry News, and it covers the whole subject matter. But taking a leaf out of an organization called The Morning Brew. The Morning Brew have a number of different newsletters aimed at the general same audience, but depending on what kind of communication and niche. So you get a very tailored, maybe it's just financial, or maybe it's just tech, or maybe it's just this. So within anybody listening to this within your own industry, think about the customers that you sell into individually. And that's a potential podcast for each of one of those.
Correct.
To the same audience. And then there's cross promotion, there's cross sponsorship, there's leveraging of audience and all that kind of stuff. So I think there's so much opportunity around podcasts with such little barrier to entry. I just don't understand why more people don't do it. One of the things that I have heard, and I don't know whether you've heard the same, Jason, is people are reluctant to enter podcasting because they think it's saturated.
I hear it every single day. It's my favorite thing to be asked is people ask me, do you think it's a saturated market? And I've got two answers depending on my audience base. Mm-hmm. First, I say, oh, that's interesting. Do you have a website? And they, yeah. And I go, oh, 1.7 billion websites on the internet as of this month, beginning of April. Yeah. If you're listening to this different time of April. In April 2020, there were 1.7 billion websites. No one is going, I shouldn't start a website. It's saturated market. Then I might say, oh, have you ever done a YouTube video? And they'll go, oh yeah, of course. 500 million YouTube videos. Only 850,000 podcasts. Just statistically, you have a better shot at a podcast. And here's the best thing. If you do a YouTube channel, if I come on and do a YouTube channel, I am literally starting with zero, right? Yeah. If I launch a website, I'm starting with zero. I've got to go out and get people to come look at my site. So those two are a nightmare. I start a podcast and I get you and you tweet out like you did today or you Instagram. I immediately get your fans, your followers, your friends, your family who want to hear from you. This is called a podcast Ponzi scheme, but it works every time. You scrape some of their people who stay behind and go, oh, I like Jace. I'll listen to another episode. Oh, I like that content. I'll listen to another episode. People don't realize that. And you have something unique. You have an idea. You have a voice. You have maybe an avatar, that hasn't been attached. And I say avatar, meaning the perfect ideal listener. Yeah. What you do is very difficult because you have a range of subjects that you are putting out there, but all of this one umbrella. The truth is in podcasting, much like most sort of niche businesses, niches to riches, as the Americans say. If you could tighten that avatar just to Star Trek fans of the first Star Trek film only, it's a lot easier to talk to them. It's a lot easier to sell to them because you speak the same language. You bring up the same reference points. There's these commonalities. And then it's really, really easy to profitize versus doing what you do, which is a very broad thing and hoping that someone like me who's only in events also cares about the meetings area, which, or the conference side or the expo side. Yeah. So, it's else to think about when you're setting up. But no, it's far from saturated. You've got an incredible opportunity. Your voice probably doesn't sound like everyone else's. Your message won't be the same. And there's so many ways to do it. There's on our very first lesson of Podcast Made Perfect, which is the first course I ever put out, we did a thing where I suddenly become in your head and we got like an echo frame. So I go from the one ear to the other ear and then it kind of echoes across. Well, that's a £3, piece of tech that does that. So try and do that on a YouTube video where you've got all these extra things happening. And the show takes me maybe 30 minutes to edit. So it's really so much easier. It's so quicker to adopt. There's such an opportunity with a smaller scale than everything else. But like you said, it's important to remember why you're doing it, who you do it for, who's that audience member, what your monitor streams are. So it's easy to look at the ROI of how much effort you're putting into it. And then you just need a couple of things, a computer, a phone, some sort of podcasting software, GarageBand, Audacity, depending if you've got a bit of spend, Zoom or Skype. Skype is free. I use Skype and Ecamm. The whole thing cost me $50. And my first equipment cost less than $100.
Yeah, exactly. The cost of it is not high at all. And let's just talk about distribution a little bit as well, because not only can you upload to the podcast network, if you capture video like we are here today, you can upload that to YouTube. You can use the second biggest search engine in the world
Correct.
to leverage your audience, tag it
Yep.
up, keyword it up, get people to subscribe to you there. That actually takes care of all the notification for your audience and recommendation for your future audience right there for you. You don't even have to do anything other than upload it. Literally like an hour's worth of, well, not even work. It's just like click a button and wait for it to upload, right? And then you've got other networks like Vimeo and there's just so many. I'm not going to go through and mention them. Then there's the social networks where you already have an audience. Yes, Twitter, LinkedIn, they limit, to certain amounts of time of clip, video especially. I think LinkedIn's like 10 minutes, 40-minute podcast. Divide it up into four posts. Link them all together. Episode 1, part 1, part 2, part 3, part 4. And if you're very good and you get very good at programming, and you can actually program 4 parts of a podcast and they stand alone on their own as that own short 10 minutes, then you've essentially created 4 podcasts, not 1, right?
Yeah.
And the network effect of being able to upload audio and video to all of these other platforms and gain eyeballs and listeners and engagement is just, and it doesn't cost anything. Really, 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 in the grand scheme of things.
We have a strategy. We show them how from one podcast event, you can create 190 days worth of social media content. And people, that's impossible. We send them the ebook. We charge for the ebook, but if they join the course, we give it them for free. But they go, this is insane. Like we didn't even realize you could do, audiograms, transcription, blogs, SEO, multiple clips, interview style, YouTube video, and we just run through it and we show them the exact systems. And every time it's this kind of, whoa, and especially now, right, when it's so hard to make content, you can't be in your Lamborghini driving up and down the road in your bikini. It's not getting as much attention because you're stuck in your house, isolated. Well, guess what? In a podcast, 20% is me talking to you, 80% is people imagining if I'm wearing pants. So all these things come into, it's like reading a book. You're filling in so much information. And you can utilize that through social media, through all these other things, SEO, back to your brand, backlinks, back to your website. Again, podcast, and for very little attention, little time, and little effort to make a little ripple. Don't get me wrong. Obviously, the effort you put in, the better action you have, the better quality of intro music, outro music, understanding format. All these things will make gigantic differences, but you can just jump in and kind of work it out, and you'll probably trade for a while.
Yeah, I mean, in the interest of everybody listening, and I do speak at events, so I will give that caveat to it. So I have that experience of engaging with people, holding the conversation with people that aren't talking back to me. So I have that experience. But actually, before a couple of episodes to this, we had another podcast host he's still with us. He's not gone anywhere. He's just taking some time off. And for me, this is no different to what I would think of as just another one of those catch-up calls that I have with somebody that lasts an hour, right? It just naturally flows. We know the subject matter. We know the topic. We're just capturing that conversation and putting it out there for other people to listen to. I've always said, and I still want to do this, maybe you can help me with it, Jason, I want to do a podcast in a pub and have it kind of like as a rotating conversation. And as the night goes on and people loosen up a bit with maybe a few more drinks, maybe the conversation gets interesting. But that's, without the podcast bit, that's essentially the way that I view that I'm capturing this content, and it's those really interesting conversations I have with really interesting people that I think, I just wish I could relay that to everybody else in the way that it was done in that moment in time. And podcast is perfect for that. It captures that moment, and it should just be a natural conversation between 2 people or more.
There's 2 sides to it, right? My very first episode 1, season 1, the Guestless podcast. Now, the Guestless podcast now is in its 6th season. We've got over 100 episodes. But the very first episode is me in a cafe, face shop, with the background noises, the whole thing. I mean, it's terrible. But she's ordering coffee, I think, in the middle of my interview. But I wanted it to be kind of like The Office. I wanted it to be a mockumentary with me as this fumbling host running around trying to get into work. And it did work. It did very well for its time. It was very clever for its time. There wasn't many mockumentary podcasts out there. But on the opposite side, you can also be polished. We have someone, actually a mutual friend of ours, who did a podcast, which was only 27 minutes long, But it took us 2 hours to at every time this person, I'm not going to say male or female, said like da da da, like da da da, like, and then went, oh my God, I hate it. Why does it sound like that? And we said, hold on, give it back to us. Let us do another edit. Send it back to you. Took out all the likes. There were some ums, some ahs, some ands. In fact, there were 147 ands in a 27-minute podcast. And then gave it back. It was a bit shorter. It was only like 18 minutes, but it was beautiful. The person sounded so polished and went, wow. Now again, if this was a live virtual event and you made all those mistakes, you might hang your head in shame afterwards, but you can clear up all of that. You can make it as natural as this, or incredibly polished with great sound effects, and take out the barking dog and the hooting car and the baby crying in the background.
Or the Amazon delivery driver with the wife just picking up the parcel, as you've probably heard twice now, on this, as we all are working from home and doing our best in the situation. But yeah, that's an interesting point, because it can be, as long as the content's engaging, it can be, as I like to call it, as rough and ready as this, with background noises. You know, we don't generally have many other conversation ever in our life where it's perfectly quiet, right? You know, we, even on the phone, there's background noises, there's dogs, there's passing traffic, all that kind of stuff. If I remember rightly, didn't you also do an episode on the plane?
33,000 feet.
There you go. So don't be afraid of. I very much was when I started at this, like, I need it to be perfectly quiet, because any kind of other noise in and around is going to be so distracting. And it probably is a slightly polarizing thing when it's not expected on the podcast when somebody's listening, but it's not a reason for people to switch off, because it's for an instant, right? It's just there and then. If you want to get to that level, which we've done, which we've set up studios for certain podcasts, we did one with you and Kevin Jackson and a few other people back in the early days. And that is, when you can control that and put that time and effort into it, it is better. But it's kind of like the Casey Neistat thing, right? The biggest question he gets is, what equipment do you use? What equipment do you use? What camera do you use? And people rush out and buy that camera. And he stopped giving that advice on what he uses equipment-wise. And the only advice he gave back is, just start. It doesn't matter. He was like, when I first started, it wasn't even iPhone quality cameras. It was shitty camcorders. It was anything I could get my hands on. I think he sold a film or series to CNBC or one of the American networks, if I might have just muddled that up, but he sold that to them based on like the VHS recorder, the home cam kind of style things. And it's again, it comes back to podcasting. It's about the content, right? It's about the content, and then you can build upon the production level over and above that and reinvest and make the audio better. We actually advise our guests. I caught Jason out on this one, but we advise our guests, you know, for the small investment that you would make for you to buy a cheap podcasting mic off Amazon, it makes this conversation so much better between us. So it's also somewhat reliant on the person coming on the podcast as well.
So here's a hack for that. And it's funny because I was going to send this to you for notes after this podcast. We train obviously all the prospects of podcasting. One of them is the legality and equipment. So before this happens between you and I or any of your guests, we send an email that says, by the way, 2 things you need to understand. 1, audio quality is incredibly important. If you don't at least have a Logitech 350 headset, which costs 47 quid, and here's the link, click here, which, by the way, you click it through my Amazon affiliate link, so I make money out of it. So another way to monetize a podcast. Then we will send you one. We'll send you one. You can send it back to us because it's only costing us $30, and we know that you'll have good audio quality. And what it does, little caveat, if you don't like the interview, you can send an email after says, I'm really sorry, your headset didn't work. It didn't sound so great on my side, so I had to cancel and cut you. And they don't mind, and you're fine to go, as opposed to, actually, you were terrible, and I don't want to do that to my guests. The second thing is, we send a little thing that says, by the way, we own this medium. Because I could have this great interview with you, and 3 hours from now, my publicist says, Jason, I don't want you talking badly about online events. You've just got this huge virtual event you're hosting, and you just badmouthed it saying podcasting is better. I can call you up and legally remove this entire show. But if you've just sent an email that said, welcome, and here's the equipment you need, and in small letters at the bottom said, by the way, all media that is recorded with us is owned by Adam Perry Productions, there's nothing I can do. And what I wanted to say is, that's
a really good point.
And I will send you an example of the exact legal terminology you can use. But the Audica mic, for example, is Audica, I think it's the AR210. Audio Technica ATR 2100 has sold out for the first time in the history of Amazon, UK and US.
Wow.
Because so many people realize it's $45 and you sound like a professional speaker through a podcast. The reason I haven't linked it up is I've just bought the Rodecaster Pro, which is an entire studio, and I haven't figured it out yet. I'm all the gear, no idea.
That's the route that you go down when you do start getting into things. You then justify huge expenses on bettering your equipment, and why not? We actually do generally, and Jason, I didn't do this for you, but we do generally send podcast instructions with everything outlined on that. Interestingly, we don't own, I just so you know, Jason, I own all this media after this podcast. But yeah, it's a really good point about covering yourself and those kind of that kind of information and tips. I think it just clarifies to everybody what the expectations are from the outset, right? What is expected. Correct. If you don't ask somebody, by the way, would you mind getting a better mic? They're not going to get a better mic.
No.
It's as simple as just laying it out of what your expectations are. Another great piece of advice for me is, and we're building this for Event Industry News at the moment, is have just a quick survey for your host that says, tell me some interesting stuff about you. How do you want to be what's the childhood story? What your dreams and aspirations be? And that can be fed into the podcast to make it just so much more than about that topic. You get much more insight into the actual person themselves.
We did a study of the top 50 7- and 8-figure podcasters, and they were worth that much through their podcast, or their download numbers were in the millions and 100 millions. And there was an actual script. We noticed that there was an actual 8-step formula that they got almost every single guest to do. They just had different ways of doing it, but it always started with an origin story. Tell me about how you got here. And then this epiphany bridge. Then what happened? What was the aha moment? Then tell me the extrinsic thing that occurred. Then the intrinsic thing that happened. And then success came. But then guess what? There was conflict. And all this is, those writers out there will know, it's the hero's journey. It's the thing that connects us to an audience, an author, a hero on a story page. And you can do the same thing with brands. You're winning. You're absolutely winning. And we use it all the time. It's one of, I think, 2 or 3 scripts that we send out to all our clients to say, look, this works no matter who you're interviewing. And it's so simple. Have a good headphone, ask these certain questions, do it in a certain way, make sure there's a beginning, a middle, and an end, have a call to action at the end, and also work out what success looks like. The biggest thing right now in podcasting is something called pod fade, which means the average podcast has only got 3 episodes. Something happens in 1 in 3 where they go, nah, it didn't work out, because they didn't work out what success looked like for the show.
Do you think that is, we live in a world of instant gratification, right? Do you think that's the case of, well, I've only had a few people listen to my first one, I've had a few people listen to my second one, maybe a few more. I'm also really struggling to find the time to think about interesting guests, blah, blah, blah. Do you think that, because I tell this story about Event Industry News, right? Event Industry News now reaches an international audience. We reach everybody, we reach people in every part of the corner of the globe. We have gone from zero. Literally the first person to ever subscribe or follow our social media channels was myself, right? I was number 1 on Twitter. We've now over 50,000. We have a group on LinkedIn over 100,000.
Amazing.
Our page on EIN has, just on LinkedIn, has over 38,000 followers. We gain millions and billions and millions of page impressions every year through digital media and Event Industry News. But that's a decade's worth of work, right? And we didn't even launch a podcast till a few years ago. So, we kind of focused on all of that other stuff first. And then we had an audience which we could deliver a podcast through. So our podcast has grown quite quickly. I think 60,000 listeners over the last year or something like that. But I think, I don't know whether you agree to this, but I think it's just people expect too much too quickly.
They do. And also they don't do the work up front. It's like people who start businesses and then don't know what to do with it after a while. A business and a podcast is almost the opposite of marriage. In marriage, you do all the work in the beginning, because you're thinking, oh, when I get it, I've got it, I'm good. But in a business and a podcast, you should really thinking about the end. What does the end look like?
Yeah.
Do you sell the business? Do you sell the podcast? Do you hand it over to a younger generation? Is there a new opportunity? Do you franchise it? Do you, all these different things? Really think about that. And then think of what success looks like. We've got a gentleman, a common friend of ours, Caleb Parker. We did the Work Bold podcast for him. We built him a podcast. We asked him right in the front, what does success look like? Is it lots of listeners? Is it lots of engagement? Is it lots of subscribers? And he said, no, I want to be seen as an expert leader. And if I interview other experts, immediately that'll happen. So guess what we paid attention to every time we put out one of his shows? Yep. What were the other people putting him on? What lists was he suddenly added on? All of a sudden he's in the top 100 people in prop tech, et cetera, et cetera. Well, great. Wow. Then it's success. No matter what happens to the show now, congratulations, you've done your job. And now we're doing season 2 with him. We're saying, well, what's the next thing? Is it, more opportunity to travel? More? Is it money? Is it monetary? Is it more listeners? Is it higher ranking on the iTunes charts? Like, let's right at the beginning, choose one KPI that is success. Don't go, I also want fans. I also want to be mentioned. I also want to be on other shows. I also want one. Choose one business model, one engagement metric, one metric of success, and you'll be fine.
I think that's so important. The reason to launch something like a podcast does not necessarily have to mean dollars and pounds in the bank account right there and then, right? It could be like Caleb's done, which is he's raised himself up. He's increased the awareness of him. He's positioned himself as a thought leader. I mean, Caleb was already really good at that kind of stuff anyway, but clearly the investment from him in his marketing budget in working with you to make him a good podcast host, launching that podcast, the podcast equipment, the time spent in obviously bringing in thought leaders and things like that, that's going to help, elevate him as well, has done exactly that. Without another dollar coming back into him, it probably has retrospectively or on
he
the
has
peripheral.
done very well, funny enough.
Yeah, exactly. In the transfer, Caleb recently sold his company, didn't he, to another company.
Yes,
I'm sure the podcast had partly to do with that. I know it's a brand that they've continued to invest in going forward and stuff as well. So there are so many reasons to do a podcast. Jason, to wrap up, I can imagine me being sat on the other end of this, listening and going, I want to launch. I need somebody to teach me, like somebody would have a professional, somebody teach them how to speak or be a TV host or anything like that. Let's just recap on where people can engage with you, with your courses, with your guides, your ebooks, all that kind of content that they can get hold of and help teach themselves. Where can they get that?
www.apodcastmasterclass.com. It's got all the information there. It'll say sold out, but there's an email. You can email me. There's actually a link to my calendar. My VA will book you in for a 15-minute consultation. And let's just see if it's right for you and your brand. I'm 100% transparent. I'm 100% honest. I'll tell you if I think it, doesn't fit your metric, but I'll always ask you first, what does success look like? So have that prepared. Don't come in and go, I don't know what I want to do with my podcast. I just want a podcast. Because I'll tell you right off the bat, don't bother. There's so many better things to spend your time and money on. So please feel free to reach out to me. I'm very easy to find. You just Google Jason Allan Scott, spell Allan right, Allan, and you'll definitely find me.
And a recap of your own podcast where people can listen about those individual topics.
If you're a wantrepreneur, entrepreneur, someone looking for a side hustle, the Guestless podcast is our #1 show. If you're in events and you're looking to be smarter, you want to hear from people like Adam and things like that, then Smarter Event Planning. If you're in the crypto space, then of course, Not Another Crypto Show. And if you're a parent currently going through this pandemic, definitely check out Treasure Time podcast.
Amazing. And we will link to all of these in the show notes so people can go to those. We'll also throw Jason's affiliate link in there to the podcast mic. And even though it's sold out, I'm sure that'll track through somewhere, or other options will present themselves, other brands are available and that kind of stuff. Jason, I mean, this is one of those situations where I'm sure we could totally go off on tangents and do a whole Joe Rogan episode. I'd like to thank you personally for giving me the time at such short notice to come on and speak to me about this. I hope those listening or watching have found this useful. If you have, please let Jason and myself know on social media. Follow us, like, share, all that kind of stuff. And we'll speak to you soon, Jason.
Thank you very much, big guy. Take care of you.